Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur. I hope you're doing well. I'm wearing my psychedelic Christmas tie because I just finished reading Jerusalem by William Blake. His longest, in my reading, his most challenging of the really beautiful illuminated works, his prophetic works. And it was an extremely challenging book, probably the most challenging I've read in 2020, and I'm including Foucault's Pendulum, Ovid's Metamorphoses, 2666. All of those were much longer, and that was part of why they were challenging. They were long, they had many ideas going on. This is about 120 pages total of text, but it was very challenging. It was very dense. Now, I don't want to make that seem like it's not something you should read, but I do want to describe a little bit of the preparation I did in order to read it and try to have some clue about what the heck I was reading and experiencing, and then just point out a couple of ideas, sort of things that jumped out at me in my reading. Certainly not an interpretation or even really an overview of it. And then just talk about a couple of specific pieces around why I found it challenging and some works it connects to. So, what did I do in prep for reading Jerusalem? Well, I read all of the book of Isaiah, and I read all of the book of Ezekiel. When I read Ezekiel, I had read it earlier this summer, right before I read the book of Revelation, and so, all from the Bible. And so when I read Ezekiel this time, I read it in the King James Version, which is not what I usually do. I understand it. There's beautiful English language in there, but that's not the translation I prefer. So I did all of that. And in the past, I've read Milton, I've read the Four Zoas, I've read Songs of Innocence and Experience, Marriage of Heaven and Hell, and I like those. Four Zoas is weird and strange. But I think Blake's an absolutely amazing lyric poet. Jerusalem is not lyric poetry. It is closer to some combination of, Hebrew poetry that has been translated in English and is no longer poetic, as in, from the Bible, or, it's not even the iambic pentameter that we see in Milton or Shakespeare. And so that's part of why it's challenging, but it's very interesting. And I do want to show off a couple of in this edition, it doesn't have the whole text, but it has a number of really beautiful color plates. So I just wanted to show those off. They're really quite pretty. And that's part of the fun of reading Blake, is you get the just glorious illustrations. And you can see that the text in there can be kind of difficult to actually read. So it's nice to have a version where it actually has the text, and you can, read the text but also see the illustrations. Just because, they really are, fabulous and fascinating, and they truly are works of art in addition to, with the poetry. It's a full work that needs to be appreciated. So getting into it, there's four chapters to Jerusalem, and it is roughly modeled on the book of Ezekiel, which is why I had read it. And so we see a couple of things. Now, there's deep intertextuality in there, and it's made clear very, almost right away. Like the first couple plates are sort of almost like title, just almost pure illustration. And so on plate 5, we get this deep intertextuality with Ezekiel, where it starts listing some of the nations Ezekiel is prophesying, like, imprecatory curses towards Moab, Ammon, Amalek. And then later on within that same plate, another key theme within all of Blake's writing, where he sort of, in my mind, is sort of the first major romantic who's a deep romantic writer. And I mean like the romanticism is a movement, not romance, just as a genre. But he's pushing it, and he's somewhat direct in his polemics around who he starts to call out. He talks about abstract philosophy warring in enmity against imagination, which is the divine body of the Lord Jesus, blessed forever. And so there's this sense that Blake values imagination above reason. And so he very much is in this conflict with the Enlightenment that has sort of crested. And he's not just in conflict with the Enlightenment, because in chapter 3, he name checks John Locke, Isaac Newton, Voltaire, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the Confessions specifically, and tears into those. So he's in conflict against all of these Enlightenment thinkers, but he's also in conflict with the English poets of that period. So individuals like John Dryden, even Alexander Pope, I would say to a certain degree, and I enjoy Pope, Dryden less so. So he's in this conflict with them, where he's not he's not pushing for abstract philosophy, he's pushing for imagination. And so we move forward, and this is still all in chapter 1. So on plate 7, there's a line about seeing the Lamb of God, where they desire to place the abomination of desolation. And that refers to a key historical event where one of the Hellenistic kings, violated Jewish law and cultural tradition by sacrificing in their temple, in the second temple. And I believe he sacrificed a pig, which made it like even worse. He had been humiliated in Egypt. And so he was very frustrated and decided to take it out on this kingdom. And that led to the Maccabean revolt in Judea. And so that's historical context. But if we think about what is the abomination of desolation, if we're saying that the imagination is sort of the most sacred aspect, what would be violating the imagination? And we start to get that later on. So in plate 10, that's sort of confirmed. Abstract reasoning, and it's negating the actual substance from which it is derived in every divine member. So, I would say just imagine Plato's horror at all of this. But we get into this idea that if the body is going to be governed by purely reason and not by imagination, then the body acts almost as and the mind acts as like a cage for the imagination, and they trap it, and the imagination is not able to run free. And that becomes this idea that Albion and Jerusalem are not just personifications or single figures within this long poem Jerusalem. They are individuals, but they're also standing in for sort of a people, a culture, a nation. And there's this aspect, and he makes it clear at one point where he refers to it as a like somewhat Trinitarian idea, where it's threefold, where it's the individual, it's the nation, and then he has this phrase about it being sort of an angelic emanation. And I think in my reading, what that is akin to is sort of the idea of like the daimon that Socrates refers to in Plato's Phaedo. That there's this, this idea of like a soul or spiritual consciousness that is separate from, part of, but separate from like just the mind itself. And that's sort of the third aspect. And we get more Ezekiel. So plate 12 draws all these equivalences about Albion and Jerusalem. And there's like all of these descriptions that mirror the very end of Ezekiel and the description of, sort of this like holy in the sense of like set apart land and how it would be divided up in a new renewed kingdom. There's also a really interesting aspect, and it pops up throughout all 4 chapters, more so in chapters 1, 3, and 4, I noticed. This idea of like male-female or female-male duality, both around Albion, who is primarily male, and Jerusalem, who is primarily female, but they're also referred to, using the other gender. And there's an aspect to it that is very reminiscent of saying 114 from the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, or the Coptic Gospel of Thomas, which I'm fairly certain Blake was not aware of, because I'm pretty certain it was discovered in the not in the Dead Scrolls, in the Nag Hammadi library in the 20th century. So I don't think he would have been aware of it, but there's this strain of Gnostic thought that pushes out that really closely mirrors saying 114, which is the last saying in that text. So moving on, plate 37. Each man is in his specter's power until the arrival of that hour, when his humanity awake and cast his specter into the lake. And so this is really interesting. The specter is the aspect of, rather than like a conscience, it's like a pure rational, pure mind, pure reason conscience that has no imagination. And so there's this aspect of where that Blake is pushing that you have to take, if you're purely living by reason, then you have to take that and cast it into the lake. And my interpretation is that would refer to like the lake of fire, similar to the book of Revelation. Plate 53 kind of reinforces that. Man divided from his emanation is a dark specter. His emanation is an ever-weeping, melancholy shadow. But she is made receptive of generation through mercy in the potter's furnace. And that without the emanation, without imagination, without action, in a sense, the human being becomes isolated. And there's a saying around this concept of like poverty of imagination, where individuals are unable to imagine like a path forward, and then within the text, Blake starts to point out this idea of like those who are having to toil at their labor all the time. Do they have time for imagination? Do they have time to like think and wonder and reflect? And that's still very relevant, to me at least. And so it's sort of, counterpointed by plates 59 and 60, because there's these descriptions of Jerusalem. So by this point, because I believe we're in chapter 3 now, there's these descriptions where Albion has sort of fallen and died, and there's been mourning about that in chapter 2, and there's some Christology that seems to be going on there. But in chapter 3 now, we see Jerusalem is sort of trapped and unable to, isn't necessarily like separated from emanation, separated from imagination, but is unable to really have time to do that, because Jerusalem is toiling at the mill, incessant turning day and night without rest. Insane she raves upon the hoarse winds, inarticulate. And so her imagination has no voice. It has no necessarily purpose behind it. And then continuing forward, this was just kind of an interesting little piece I noticed in plate 73. There's this concept of limits. I don't think calculus, but the way he rips at Newton a little bit, it wouldn't surprise me if Blake is making a calculus joke in here too. Opens the furnaces of afflictions in the emanation, fixing the sexual into an ever prolific generation, naming the limit of opaqueness Satan and the limit of contraction Adam. And it closes with this incredible, in chapter 4, this just incredible sequence that feels very much out of Milton, where the sun sort of leads a chariot in a massive cavalry charge against Satan and company to vanquish them, and Blake creates this sequence where they there's always the four Zoas, and they draw their bows, and they're all pulling back their bows, and they all have different colored arrows and bows that they're using, and it's the arrows are from the quiver of love, and they unleash these. And he had made a previous one at the end of chapter 3 about this idea of like every day, what are you doing to build the new Jerusalem? Kind of a theme that was within Ezekiel, that the current Jerusalem will be destroyed by the Babylonians. So there's going to be a new Jerusalem, and it's going to be built and, be so much better. And as I said, set apart. And so Blake is sort of in this push of like, through our imagination, what can we be doing to build that new Jerusalem? And that's sort of how the book closes as a whole. So like I said, it's really interesting. It's really fascinating. It's challenging as all get out. And I think a reason for that is that it inhabits a unique mythology. It inhabits Blake's mythology. And unless one has been reading deeply in Blake's mythology, there are names in there that just don't feel like they make sense. And I think it's akin to someone who has never read through the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament before and sitting down and reading Ezekiel. It probably doesn't make any sense. The names would be very difficult. The Hebrew names would be very difficult. The references to other events that have been occurring in, Second Kings wouldn't make any sense. The importance of this Jerusalem or of, the other, Edom, Moab, Ammon, like, who are these places? What are they? And none of it would make sense. The context would be missing. And so I think that's part of why Blake's writing is so challenging. When I read Homer, I know the history of Trojan War. I know these names. I know the names of these gods, so I can fit it all together. When I read Ezekiel, I've read it multiple times. I can put pieces together. I have a schema that I'm putting the puzzle pieces into. But with Blake, that doesn't feel like the case. And it can be a very challenging text. I wouldn't recommend Jerusalem as your first Blake. Like I said, he's a fabulous lyric poet. Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience would always be my first recommendation. Marriage of Heaven and Hell is very short. Milton is about half the length of Jerusalem. So the four Zoes is really complex. It would help you understand Jerusalem, but it is very, very complex and weird. So those are some thoughts. Oh, the other thing The other reason that I think it's difficult kind of refers to an idea Edgar Allan Poe pushed in the theory of poetry, which is that in Poe's opinion, and sometimes I think Poe's right, sometimes I disagree, but in Poe's opinion, a work is best enjoyed if it can be read in a single sitting. And so he has this whole theory of poetry in which he talks about the Raven and like how it's long enough to be read in one sitting and sustained and interesting, but it's not so long that you start to get bored and drop off. And he specifically points at John Milton's Paradise Lost and says there are parts of it that I absolutely love, and there are parts of it that I don't, and because I don't enjoy those, it doesn't necessarily magnify the peaks. It just, sort of averages the work down to a different level. And I think there were parts of my reading of Jerusalem that felt that way. The end of each chapter was transcendent and amazing. There were also parts as a whole where I had to go back and reread, or I was just totally befuddled and confused. The other weird connection I came up with was there's an aspect of Hazel Motes from Flannery O'Connor's Wise Blood, who I think kind of acts as the antithesis of what Blake is pushing in terms of imagination. And that is that Hazel Motes is, wrapped up in reason and denying imagination, denying any aspect of spirituality. And we see what that leads to with Motes. I don't want to spoil Wise Blood for anybody. Another counterpoint, sort of specifically within the Romantic movement, would be Goethe to me, who I find is much more of an enlightened, like on the side of the Enlightenment than on the side of the Romanticism when I'm reading, except for Faust Part 2, which I love. I find that much of the rest of Goethe seems to be pushed. It's romanticism, but it's deeply rooted and founded in the Enlightenment. Unlike Blake, who is furiously swashbuckling with the Enlightenment. Milton, of course, is just a key text for Blake, specifically, Paradise Lost, I would say, more so than Paradise Regained or Samson Agonistes. The 17th and 18th century English poets certainly come in for a few criticisms or comments. Voltaire, and as I mentioned, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and specifically his Confessions, come in for some strong words from Mr. William Blake. And then one writer who I find, I don't know that there are many writers who are actually influenced by William Blake in a way that enhances their writing. I think there are people who aspire to be like William Blake and are just confusing. But the one writer who I think is inspired by William Blake and finds some success with that would be Alan Moore. And specifically, I think there are aspects of the From Hell sequence about the Whitechapel murders that kind of push at some of those other strange, like ethereal, spiritual ideas that Blake was pushing. So that was my, thoughts on Jerusalem. A deeply challenging text, but welcome to try it out. And please let me know if you have other interpretations, other comments. I'm happy to learn, because that's very much where I'm at with this text. So hope everybody's doing well and has a great holiday if you're celebrating. So have a good one. Thanks.